The rain had stopped just an hour before the gala began, leaving the city glistening like it had been polished for the occasion. Inside the grand ballroom, chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors, catching the edges of sequined gowns and crisp black suits. Soft music floated in the air, barely competing with the hum of conversation and the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Every corner of the room smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. It was the kind of night that felt perfectly orchestrated, as if nothing could go wrong. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Her hair was pinned in place with delicate pearls, her gown a shade of ivory that whispered of quiet elegance rather than loud opulence. The makeup artist had said she looked radiant, and for the first time in years, she believed it. Tonight was meant to be the official announcement, the night the man she loved would stand before their families, their friends, and the city's most influential guests to declare that she was his future. Before I tell you what happened that night, I need you to do one thing. Subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of this story, and tell me in the comments if you saw someone's life fall apart in front of everyone. Would you step in, or would you just watch? She scanned the room, her heart beating faster each time her eyes landed on him. He was talking to one of the board members, the practiced smile on his face, the same one he used at fundraisers and business meetings. But when his gaze met hers across the crowd, she swore there was something softer there, something meant only for her. She let that look anchor her in the middle of all the glitter and noise. The MC's voice boomed gently over the speakers, calling for everyone's attention. Conversations quieted, glasses were lowered, and all eyes turned toward the man she loved as he stepped onto the small stage. Her chest swelled. She imagined the words he would say, the warmth of his hand as he reached for hers. She imagined applause, smiles, and the weight of a diamond ring that would finally make their future certain. But then, the first sentence didn't match the script she had been rehearsing in her head for months. His voice was calm, even polite, but there was a chill to it. He spoke her name with a distance that made her skin prickle. The room seemed to tilt ever so slightly. She clutched her clutch bag tighter, the metal clasp pressing into her palm. There was a strange murmur in the crowd, a ripple of confusion as he continued speaking. She heard words that didn't belong in this night, words like differences, future apart, decision for the best. They cut into her like fine glass, clean and sharp. Her smile froze, not out of vanity, but out of instinct. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, each one searching her face for a reaction. The ballroom felt suddenly colder, the air heavier, even the chandeliers seemed dimmer. Somewhere near the back, someone gasped. Nearer, a woman whispered to her companion, and though the words were muffled, she caught enough to understand. They were already writing her version of the story, a public ending, a public humiliation. Her ears rang. She couldn't hear the rest of what he said, only the polite smattering of applause that followed. It wasn't the sound of support, it was the sound of people trying to pretend they weren't witnessing something cruel. Her vision blurred, not from tears, at least not yet, but from the sheer force of trying to hold herself together. If she broke here, she would shatter completely. The marble beneath her heels felt like it might swallow her whole. She considered turning and walking out, letting the doors close behind her like a final curtain, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped, not by fear, but by the raw disbelief that this was happening at all. In that moment, she became hyper-aware of every detail. The slow sway of the string quartet, the faint click of champagne glasses being set down, the smell of the roses suddenly too sweet, almost sickening, and then from somewhere in the crowd, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound of that chair scraping against the marble cut through the thick silence like a blade. Heads turned, whispers broke the tension for a split second, and her eyes followed the sound almost instinctively. He was standing, not her fiancé, no, ex-fiancé now, though the word felt foreign and heavy in her mind. This was someone else entirely. She didn't know him, or at least she was certain she had never seen him before tonight. He wasn't dressed like the others in the room. His tuxedo was immaculate, yes, but there was something effortless about it, as if wearing it wasn't a performance, but simply an extension of who he was. His hair was slightly tousled, as though he had run a hand through it moments before. He didn't hesitate, didn't glance around for permission or approval. He simply walked toward her with a quiet confidence that somehow cut through the suffocating embarrassment clinging to her like smoke. Each step was deliberate, measured, almost rhythmic with the faint hum of the string quartet. The crowd parted for him, not dramatically, but naturally, as if they understood instinctively that this was someone who didn't stop once he started moving. She couldn't look away. There was no smile on his face, no mocking glint in his eyes. He wasn't here to gawk at her humiliation. If anything, there was something else there, something she couldn't name yet. When he reached her, he didn't say anything at first. He simply extended his hand. For a moment, she hesitated. This entire night had already unraveled so violently that she wasn't sure she could trust anything, not even a gesture as simple as this. But the way he held it out, steady and unshaken, told her it wasn't an offer born out of pity. Pity was soft, hesitant. This was firm, unwavering. Her finger slipped into his before she could think of a reason not to, and the warmth of his palm was startling against her cold skin. Without a word, he began to lead her away from the small circle of curious faces, past the table where her ex stood frozen, unsure how to react. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. All she could focus on was the stranger's hand, the way it guided her through the stairs, the way his presence seemed to cut through the suffocating fog of shame. When they reached the center of the ballroom, the music shifted. The quartet, perhaps sensing something unspoken, eased into a slower, richer melody. It was the kind of song that filled every corner of a room, warm and unhurried, inviting without demanding. He placed his other hand lightly at her waist, his touch gentle but certain, and began to move. For the first few steps, she was stiff, her body still bracing for impact. The humiliation still clung to her, and she could feel the weight of every gaze burning into her skin. But he didn't falter. His movements were steady, his eyes locked on hers. Not intrusively, but with a quiet focus that made it impossible for her to look away. It was in that gaze that she realized something strange. He wasn't trying to distract her from what had happened. He wasn't pretending it hadn't occurred. If anything, it felt like he was saying without words, "Let them watch." But watch this instead. Around them, the whispers softened. The crowd, so hungry for scandal just moments ago, was slowly being pulled into something else entirely. Their expressions shifted, not to sympathy, but to something closer to fascination. The pity was evaporating. The story was changing. Her breathing began to match his rhythm, and without realizing it, her steps grew lighter. The music wrapped around them like a cocoon, isolating them from the weight of the room. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he had done this. But in that moment, she understood that the power her ex had stolen from her minutes ago wasn't gone. It was right here, in her hands, in the sway of her body, in the way she was being seen now. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, as if he could feel her beginning to shift. It wasn't a grin of victory. It was something subtler. Approval, reassurance. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he had chosen this moment, her, but the words never came. And maybe they didn't need to, not yet. The final note of the song hung in the air longer than it should have, as if even the music didn't want to let go. When it faded, there was no applause, only a silence so deep it felt like a held breath. And in that silence, she realized every single person in that ballroom was waiting to see what would happen next. The silence that followed the last note was almost heavier than the music itself. No one clapped. No one dared to speak. The air felt dense, as if the walls of the ballroom had leaned in to witness the scene more closely. She was still standing in his arms, her breath uneven, her pulse quickening, not from the dance, but from the weight of 100 eyes fixed on them. The stranger didn't release her immediately. His hand lingered at her waist, not possessively, but as though anchoring her in place until she was ready to stand alone again. His gaze stayed locked on hers, steady and unreadable, and it was that unwavering calm that unnerved her most. Finally, he stepped back just enough to break the physical connection, but not the strange magnetic pull between them. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and oddly intimate, and then, without so much as a glance at the crowd, he reached for her hand again. The murmur of whispers began to ripple back through the room, cautious at first, then louder, as if everyone had been holding their voices in until this moment. She could hear snippets, fragments of disbelief, curiosity, speculation. Who is he? Do you think they know each other? I've never seen him at one of these events. Her ex-fiancé stood several feet away, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of a champagne flute so hard she thought it might shatter. He looked like a man caught off guard in his own game, and that thought sparked something small but potent inside her, something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. The stranger, still holding her hand, began to guide her toward the edge of the ballroom. Not toward the exit, she noticed that immediately, but toward a quieter corner where the shadows from the tall velvet drapes softened the golden glow of the chandeliers. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it. He stopped walking, turning just enough to face her fully. Up close, she could see details she hadn't before. The faint line of a scar near his temple, the way his eyes held a depth that wasn't easily explained. Because no one should be left standing alone in a room like that, he said simply. It wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't charming or rehearsed or meant to impress. It was matter of fact, almost blunt, and yet it hit her harder than any grand declaration could have. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, someone approached. A woman in a deep emerald gown, tall and sharp-featured, her expression carefully schooled into polite interest. That was quite the display, the woman said, her eyes darting between them. You'll have to forgive me for asking, but do you two know each other? The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her, giving her the choice. It was subtle, but she felt it. He was letting her decide the story they would tell. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "Not until 5 minutes ago." The woman's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through her composure. She murmured something polite, excused herself, and melted back into the crowd. When they were alone again, she turned to him. "You really don't care what they think, do you?" His lips curved, not into a smile, but something smaller, like the ghost of one. "If I cared, I wouldn't have stood up." The answer was disarming in its simplicity. And yet there was something in his tone, an undercurrent she couldn't quite place, that made her think there was more to it than he was letting on. The rest of the evening passed in a strange blur. She didn't leave his side, though neither of them said much. It wasn't silence born of awkwardness, but the kind that comes when words would only dilute the weight of a moment. As the night wound down and guests began to trickle toward the grand double doors, she realized she didn't even know his name. It struck her suddenly, almost absurdly, considering that he had just rewritten the most humiliating moment of her life in front of an entire room. When she finally asked, he gave it to her without hesitation, but it was a name that meant nothing to her. No titles, no introductions to his world, no explanation of why he was there. By the time she left the gala, she could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers. It clung to her like an afterimage, something she knew she'd still feel tomorrow and the day after that. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, a thought took root in her mind, quiet, unshakable, and dangerous. If a man like that could appear out of nowhere in her lowest moment, there had to be a reason. The city was quieter after midnight, the kind of quiet that felt more like holding its breath than sleeping. She walked a long way home, the sound of her heels against the pavement echoing in the stillness. The gala felt like a dream now, blurred at the edges, yet one moment replayed vividly. The way his hand had closed around hers, the way the room had shifted without anyone saying a word. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about him. The next morning she woke earlier than usual. It wasn't intentional. She had tossed and turned most of the night, the memory of his gaze following her into every half-formed dream. She made coffee she didn't drink, paced her apartment in bare feet, and told herself not to expect anything, but part of her did. By the afternoon, she was restless enough to open her laptop. She typed his name into the search bar, expecting, hoping to find something, a trace of who he was beyond the ballroom. Instead, she found almost nothing. A few mentions in obscure articles about charity events, always in the background of photographs, never the focus. No social media, no interviews, no details about where he worked or lived. It was unsettling. People like him, men who could walk into a room and bend its attention without asking, didn't just exist without leaving a trail. 2 days later, she saw him again. It wasn't at another gala or formal event, but at a quiet corner cafe she often visited to read. He was already there when she arrived, seated by the window, sunlight catching in his hair. This time, he looked up first. "I was starting to think you might have imagined me," he said when she approached. "Maybe I did," she replied. But she was already pulling out the chair across from him. They talked, not about the gala, not about her ex, but about ordinary things. The weather, the books she'd been reading, the way the city always seemed to smell different after a storm. His voice was low, even, with the faintest trace of something she couldn't place. An accent, maybe, or simply a habit of measuring his words before speaking. She found herself watching him the way she might study a painting, noticing the small things first, then realizing they were part of something larger. The slight crease at the corner of his eyes when he listened intently, the way he seemed completely still even when holding a cup of coffee. At one point, she asked, "Why were you there that night?" He set his cup down slowly. "I was invited. A friend had a seat at their table but couldn't make it. It was plausible, too plausible." "You could have stayed seated," she pressed. "I could have," he agreed, his expression unreadable. "But I didn't." For a moment, the air between them felt heavier, like they were both standing on the edge of something neither was ready to name. They left the cafe together, and as they stepped outside, she noticed something strange. A man across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, looked away the instant she turned her head. She told herself it was nothing, just a passerby, but her stomach tightened all the same. Over the next week, their paths crossed again. Once in the park, where he claimed to be just passing through. Once at a bookstore, where he appeared moments after she arrived. Each time, the meetings felt coincidental enough to believe, but not enough to dismiss entirely. She didn't know whether to be comforted or unsettled by it. One evening, she invited him to walk with her along the river. The city lights reflected in the water, stretching like ribbons of gold and silver. They spoke less this time, the quiet between them feeling more deliberate. Finally, she stopped, leaning against the railing, and asked the question that had been building since the night of the gala. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Maybe I just don't like seeing someone's story written for them by people who don't deserve the pen." It wasn't the answer she expected, but it sank into her in a way she couldn't ignore. Before she could respond, he glanced over her shoulder, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. She turned just in time to see a figure disappear into the crowd, a man in a dark coat moving too quickly to be casual. Her pulse quickened. She looked back at him, but he was already watching the empty space where the man had been, and in that moment, she knew this was no coincidence. The sight of that dark coat disappearing into the crowd left her with a chill that the night air alone couldn't explain. The river behind her glittered with fractured light, but the water suddenly seemed deeper, darker, like it was reflecting something she couldn't yet see. He didn't move for several seconds, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the man had vanished. When he finally looked at her, his expression was calm, almost too calm, as if every reaction had been weighed before leaving his face. "Do you know him?" she asked, her voice lower than she intended. "No," he said after a pause, then softer. "But he knows you." A knot tightened in her stomach. "How would you—" "Because he's been following us for the last 3 blocks. The words were delivered without panic, without drama, and that somehow made them worse. They started walking again, but she was acutely aware now of every sound behind them, the click of hurried footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric in the breeze. She glanced over her shoulder twice, catching only glimpses of moving figures that vanished when she tried to focus. By the time they reached the street where her apartment was, her pulse was pounding in her ears. He stopped just short of her building. "You should go inside," he said. "What about you? I'll make sure you're not followed." It wasn't a request, and something in the way he said it, quiet but certain, made her obey. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, resisting the urge to look out the window the moment she shut the door. But she didn't need to look. 10 minutes later, there was a knock. When she opened it, he was there. "You're clear," he said simply, then stepped past her without waiting to be invited. She stood there for a moment, watching as he scanned the room, not like a guest taking in the decor, but like someone checking for entry points, blind spots, vulnerabilities. "You're making me nervous," she said, folding her arms. "Good, you should be." He sat in the chair by her window, the streetlight casting a narrow beam across his face. It was the first time she noticed how his eyes seemed to darken when he was thinking, as if every memory he carried pulled the light from them. "You're not telling me something," she said. "There are a lot of things I'm not telling you," he replied. "But the most important right now is this. What happened at the gala might not have been as public as it seemed. The person who followed us tonight, they were watching before that." Her mind spun. Before? What could they possibly want from me? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sometimes it's not about wanting something from you. Sometimes it's about wanting to see what you'll do when they take something away." She hated how his words made sense. She hated even more the thought that the humiliation she endured might have been a trigger rather than an accident. The clock ticked in the silence between them. She realized she was gripping the back of the couch, her knuckles white. Finally, she said, "And you? Why are you here, really? Because I don't believe this is all about some chivalrous moment on a dance floor." He didn't look away. "You're right, it's not." The weight of that answer sat between them, heavy and unfinished. She opened her mouth to press further, but before she could, a sharp sound split the quiet. Not from inside, but from the street below. A car door slamming, then voices, low, urgent. He was at the window in an instant, pulling the curtain just enough to see without being seen. "Stay back," he said. Her heart pounded as she moved closer anyway, standing just behind him. Down on the street, 2 men stood beside a black sedan, their faces obscured by the shadows. One of them tilted his head toward her building before they both got back into the car. The engine roared to life, and they drove off without hesitation. When he finally stepped back from the window, his jaw was tight. "They're not done." "Who are they?" she asked. His answer was slow, deliberate. "The kind of people who don't knock twice." The room felt smaller now, the walls closer. She could feel the echo of that humiliation at the gala in a new way, like it had been the first move in a game she didn't know she was playing. He stood, his eyes locking on hers. "You need to decide how much you want to know, because once you do, there's no going back. And I can't promise you'll like the answer." Her voice was steady, though her hands weren't. "Then tell me everything." He took a long breath as though weighing the cost of what he was about to say. And just before he spoke, there was another knock at the door.